Well, good evening, and welcome to our final portion of the Lenten series, in which we've invited young Episcopal priests from this diocese and elsewhere, famous young Episcopal priests, to tell us what they think is interesting about the church, what passions they have, and how they think those passions are going to play out in the world, what relevance the church will have going forward. Tonight, Katie Bradshaw is visiting with us from Ridgeland, Mississippi, St. Columns, where she is a curate. But of course, she also practiced law, and now she's a priest, and that's why she's here. Because people who practice law and priest are naturally better at the priesthood. And she's from Alabama, and I'm told that all of our good parishioners come from Alabama and Mississippi. But we are happy to have you here, so thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. When I got the email from George, it said, young dynamic priest, and I'd spent the day repairing cell phones of parishioners. And at that moment, I was making copies of crossword puzzles for 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders, and I thought, is this dynamic? Is this what he meant? But I'm glad to be here, and as he said, I've been asked to talk about what excites me about the Anglican tradition. My grandfather was murdered by a burglar. When my mother was a young child, in front of my grandmother and my uncle and my mother. They lived in Morocco at the time. He was in the Navy. And, I'm not sure it sets your life, but it did kind of set the path of my life just a little bit. It was in the 60s, and mental health was not really a thing, so they didn't receive a lot of mental health. And they lived in fear, as some victims do. My father grew up on a farm. He was the youngest son. His brother died when I was 2 years old. He took over this farm. He didn't know what he was doing. His father at the time was dying. He was 27 years old. And he would go to his father and say, "Can you tell me what to do next?" And as his father approached death one day, he said, "Look, son, I'm about to die. And there are times in life when you have to make decisions, and sometimes you make the right decision, and sometimes you make the wrong decision, but you have to stick by your decisions." And after he died, he hired this young African-American man named Wope to be his right-hand man. It's very unheard of in Southeast Alabama. And so we lived like this, and I lived in fear. And I didn't know how to pray outside of written prayers. And so at night we would pray as I lay me down to sleep. And we'd get to the end, and I'd say, "Dear God, I know I'm going to die. I know something bad's going to happen, but just let it not be tonight." When I was 12 years old, I got in bed and I said, "Enough, God, enough. Look," and I just started talking to God. And I said, "I know that I'm going to die, and maybe it's going to be in a bad way, but I can't live with this fear anymore." And it was the first real personal involvement that I had with God. And I can't explain it, but all this weight was suddenly lifted off of me, and I no longer followed our evacuation plans if something were to happen at night, because we had those. And I kept reflecting on that experience, this personal experience with God. A couple years later, my father and I were watching this documentary on Angola. It's a prison in Louisiana. It's a farming prison. I don't know if you've seen it. And my father said, "Wope was in Angola." And I said, "Well, why was Wope in Angola?" He said, "Oh, he was there. He killed somebody. He's a murderer." I said, "Does Mother know this?" He said, "Hell no, and you better not tell her either." I said, "I can't believe that you hired a murderer." And he said, "Well, he's a damn good worker, and no one else would hire him." And I thought, it's not just about me. And it's not just about my family. it's much bigger than that. And I didn't have words for it, but the first time in my life I realized that. When I was in college, I felt this call to ministry. But I love to have a good time, and so I thought, well, that's definitely not me, because, everyone going to seminary didn't really go out much, and I'd had a great time in college. So I went to law school, and I found myself because that makes sense. I thought, well, I love to talk in front of people, so this will work out, So I go to law school, and in law school, I start studying John Wesley, because I grew up Methodist. And I really got into what is this idea of sanctification and this personal sanctification. But as I read Wesley, I started reading more about the Eucharist, and it led me to the Episcopal Church. And I thought, well, really, I've been Episcopal all along, right? But it led me to the Episcopal Church. And in the Episcopal Church, what did I find but the baptismal covenant? Now, seminary professors love to tell you, don't talk about the baptismal covenant except for one time a year. I think they're wrong, because I think that, and Mary Hunter's laughing because she knows this, but I think it's actually essential in understanding salvation. In fact, when I graduated law school, I went to work for a judge, I was a staff attorney, and it was a trial judge in the eastern part of Mississippi. And I didn't make decisions, but I helped tell him what the decision maybe should be. And it was a really hard role, because we often found ourselves between this rock and hard place. And so I found this great picture of the baptismal covenant, and I put it on my desk. And every day I would read the questions, will you seek and serve Christ in all persons, loving your neighbor as yourself? Will you strive for justice and peace in the world? And this is what got me through that time. And I had no real theological understanding of that, but I knew that that was important as an ethic to this Christian faith. And it also helped me when I would see victims at the end of trials or after their persecutor had pled guilty. And I would see this look on their face. And I remember one time this rape victim said, "That's it? It's over?" Because our society had told these victims that the criminal justice system would help them find closure. But it didn't. It didn't, and I didn't know why. But I eventually found myself working for the public defender's office in Hinds County. It's one of 4 full-time public defender's offices in the state of Mississippi. So all we did was focus on defending people who couldn't afford a lawyer. And in my first murder trial, my mom was not very excited that I was representing a murderer, as you can possibly imagine. My first murder trial, our client was an African-American man, had never been in trouble with the law. He was in his 40s. Young kid, about 20-something years old, had had about 4 felonies or so, broke into his home. And our client said, "If you don't get out of my home, I'm going to shoot you." And the kid didn't leave the home, so he shot him. But it's Mississippi. And so our client was arrested. And he spent 20 months in jail awaiting trial, because actually the last 6 trials I was involved with, they were in jail longer than 18 months, every one of them awaiting trial, because that's what's happening in our system today. So he's there 20 months, and eventually he was found not guilty. And I'll never forget, my boss, who I was trying the case with, said, "We don't celebrate." Because as this week-long trial went on, no one was there for the victim. No one in his family showed up for the trial. I think his brother came for a few hours one day, but no one showed up for him. And my boss said, "We don't celebrate that. Somebody has lost their life." And I realized in that moment, I had this epiphany. that our system is so broken that there are people in this world whose lives aren't valued. No one showed up for him. And when your life is not valued, you can't value life. And that's why we have all this crime, because their lives aren't being valued. And I went back to the baptismal covenant that night, and I read, "Will you continue in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers?" And I realized that our religion is not private. As baptized Christians, our religion is not private. Christian faith is lived out in community. It is communal. Bishop Young from the Diocese of East Tennessee says, we got to keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is this: there are two kinds of people in this world. There are people that know that God loves them, and there are people that don't know that God loves them. And the sole obligation of those that know that God loves them is to help those who don't know realize that God really does love them. We have to keep the main thing, he says. And that's it. That's what our baptismal covenant is about. It's about knowing your own personal salvation, but helping everybody else realize theirs. It's helping people realize that their life is valued. We have to keep the main thing the main thing. There are a few challenges to that, I have realized. And the first is that society is obsessed with self. It's about my home and my car and my job and my money and my God, what I think that my God is. Mary Catherine Bateson is an anthropologist. I don't know if you, it's Margaret Mead's daughter, and I was recently listening to an interview with her, and she said, our society has become obsessed with the evolutionary process. And the process they're obsessed with is that some cells win out over other cells. But what we fail to realize is that for the body to actually regenerate and grow, cells have to communicate and cooperate with each other more than win out. That's what we're called to do. We're called to cooperate. But our society has forgotten this. And that's one of our challenges, to keeping the main thing the main thing. The other challenge that I see is that it's hard to see and value someone in your community that doesn't look like you. During Advent, I preached this sermon, and really the point of this sermon was to help people consider what it means to sit in silence and to reflect. So I told this story about a client that I had and his brother. They were 16 years old, Latrice and Latrice. And I went to the jail one day to visit with Latrice. He was accused of breaking and entering into a car. His brother, Latrice, was accused of murder. So I walked into the visiting room, and there Latrice sat, and he was clutching a Bible. And he told me a little bit about his case, which I can't tell you about. But at the end, he said, my brother and I are 16 years old. And our father has been dead quite a long time. And our mother just died. And people thought that we were being taken care of. But we weren't. We fell through the cracks of the system, he said. But since I've been in this jail, he told me, somebody's given me this Bible. And when I get out of here, I'm going to preach the gospel. It took my breath away. But as I was preparing for the sermon, something inside of me said, maybe you should change the names. I don't know why, but maybe you should change the names. So I get on Google, because you can Google anything, names that rhyme. And I came up with Brandon and Landon. And after the service, a man stopped me and he said, did these young men go to Madison Central High School? It's a predominantly white high school. And I said, I'm sorry? I mean, it was kind of an odd question, yeah. He said, well, when you said Brandon, I thought, oh, he could be either white or African American, I don't know. But when you said Landon, I thought, they're definitely white. And I kind of laughed, and I said, well, actually, I changed the names. It's Latrice and Latrice. And he said, well, that really changes the story, doesn't it? I thought, well, that's sad. It shouldn't change the story. But now I know. And it really bothered me. The next week, if you watch Netflix, How to Make a Murderer, The Making of a Murderer, this series started. And it was the first time that on my Facebook, my friends on the right and on the left, the Republicans and the Democrats, were all saying the very same thing about our criminal justice system, that there's a problem with it. Well, I thought, well, I've known that for quite some time, right? But what about this series is helping people realize the problem? So I sat down and watched it, and when I got to the 8th episode, I realized why people could finally see the problem. Everyone involved in the show is white. Everyone involved in the show is white. People could identify themselves in that show unlike they ever could before. Seeing others in our community that don't look like us, that's a challenge to keeping the main thing the main thing. The last big challenge I see is that we as the church forget our mission, and our mission is that we are called to reconcile all people to God and each other. But we seek reconciliation in the secular world. You see this in the criminal justice system. This is why these victims are told that when this trial has ended and when the criminal who hurt them has pled guilty, that all will be well. We're seeking reconciliation in the secular world. And that's a problem. My first week of law school, I went to see this very prominent anti-death penalty proponent, and she was speaking at Millsaps College in Jackson. And the whole time she spoke, there was a lady standing in the back of the room holding up this big sign with 5 faces on it. Her daughter had been killed by a serial killer, and she was one of the faces on there. And she stood there the whole time, and finally, this prominent spiritual leader called on her to talk. And the lady asked her question, and this spiritual leader talked to her so condescendingly that when she walked by me to leave, I wanted to spit in her face. I've never wanted to spit in anyone's face, but I wanted to spit in her face. And I got in my car, and I thought, I know I'm in law school, but if I'm ever this spiritual guy, this religious leader, I hope I remember that we have to be there for all sides. And it's not that I don't disagree with her position on the death penalty. But as the church, we're called to stand in the middle of these two ideas of justice. On one side, we have what I like to call amazing grace, where people say, open all the prison doors and let everybody out. And on the other side, I like to call it Nancy grace. I want my pound of flesh, lock everybody up. And it's so easy for the church to get polarized and get put on either side of that, but really, we're called to stand in the middle of that. We're called to live in the tension of the two. 2 weeks ago, we heard the parable of the good son, or the 2 sons, or the lost son, whatever you want to call it. And I read this great commentary that said, the dad in the story We shouldn't look at this dad as God with two sons. We should think about it as a family, really. And as I was preparing for this talk, I thought, really, the dad in this story is the church. It's the church standing in the middle of that tension. And yet, if you notice, the dad goes out to seek both of them, to bring them into the feast together. But then the dad has to wait and pray. And that's where we stand in that tension. So where is the hope? Because there has to be hope, right? I think the hope is found in food. Now, obviously, I love to eat. You can tell that. But God has always been connecting us through food. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness, and God provides this manna. It's this grace from heaven to keep them going. And Joshua, when he finally leads the Israelites into the land of milk and honey, what's the first thing they do? They eat. They keep Passover. And what did Jesus do? He ate with sinners. In Jesus' day, to eat with sinners meant that they were friends for life. They'd been reconciled to him. Jesus ate. What do we do as the church when we see people in need? We take them food. We start soup kitchens. My own church has a food pantry. We feed people. I remember in my hometown when people would die, my grandmother was like the beginning of the phone call tree to get everybody to bring food. And she would say, everybody doesn't need to bring deviled eggs. And not everybody bring those little pears with the cheese on it. She was very bossy about the food, but that's what we do. And think about when somebody asks you on a date, they say, let's go to dinner. Or sometimes they say, let's go to a movie. I haven't quite figured that out, because do you really get to know someone just sitting beside them? I really like sitting beside you, this doesn't make sense. We go to dinner. That's the easiest way to create community. And I don't think it's any happenstance that our entire worship is centered around a meal. And sometimes when I'm standing at the altar and people come up, I think, well, you and I don't agree. And you don't agree with them. And I don't look like you and you don't look like me. But here we are. We're all together sharing in this meal. It's creating community. It's what sustains us personally, but it's what sustains us as we live out and live into the challenges of being Christians in community. And I think my only fear is that we'll one day stop eating together. But until then, I think we have to keep the main thing the main thing. Now, that was not very long, but I would love to take any questions that you may have. I don't know.
And that we decided that we wouldn't but also, what about justice as consideration? Not necessarily justice as making versus justice as justice being true reconciliation. That's what we choose.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's really why I said the dad, the church, in this idea of the prodigal son. The dad doesn't just stand there. The dad goes out and meets on the road the younger son as he's coming in, right? And he goes out to meet the elder son out in the farmlands farming. And I think that's where the church gets into justice as reconciliation. You see what I mean? We're called to actually act in that going out piece. I think we've gotten really caught up in starting soup kitchens, but maybe now it's time to talk about how do we end that system that requires the soup kitchen. And that's where that going out piece is. Does that answer your question? Well, the Pew Research Center tells us that 1.5 million people are going to leave the church, but I think our hope is found in continuing to eat together, and I hope we don't get to that place. But I practiced law for almost 5 years. You can't run from God. And that's what I was doing, practicing law. I felt called to this ministry, and I said, I don't want to change the world. And everyone going to seminary wanted to change the world. Bishop Gray, who sent me to seminary, loves to laugh about that. But eventually I realized that that feeling came back, that I can do just as much and more work in reconciling the world as priest than lawyer. Besides fixing cell phones. It's a transition-sized church, so we have an average Sunday attendance of about 200, and I'm a curate to the priest in charge, and really my areas are Christian formation, so I do a lot of teaching, and youth, which is a new thing for me. It's been fun, and so I have a boss, and that's basically what we do. But we have a food pantry in West Jackson, and we feed about 50 to 100 families every Friday. So it's a really big operation, and that's where I am now. But I'm not going to do a whole lot of the social justice stuff. But next go around, right? Anyone else have any questions?
To what extent is the church, meaning the physical church, taking its role as it once did?
Mm-hmm.
Quite a bit. What may or may not be going on?
A couple of weeks ago, I spoke at a church in Rome, Georgia, and they were about the incarceration system in America. And they asked me a similar question, and I think that our hope is found in these mental health courts. And in fact, the first one was started in Rome, Georgia, in their county. I don't know the name of the county. Dade County, Florida has one. And I think that's where the church can help start. And you could pick any place, right, in our criminal justice system where point A to start with. But that's really where I think we ought to start, is mental health courts, because so many of my clients were locked up because they had mental illness, and they had nowhere else to go. In fact, I inherited 2 clients who had been in jail both 4 years awaiting trial because there are only 15 beds for the criminally insane in Mississippi right now. That's a problem. And I can't tell you how many people get arrested and they get in jail and they get on their meds, and you meet them and they're a completely different person. But we don't have the mental health system to be able to start, and I think that the church can really be helpful in that.
Well, you don't have water. You know, back to home, being the sand, walk, and wait on next. So,
Mm-hmm.
I just remember that when I was with her, there was a lot of calls. Some of the woman back, a lot of calls. It always seemed to me, my church, anyway, was very prominent. Many folks, they were very unpopular. And those of them grew up in it. They were very popular.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly Southern priests, Southern federal judges. That was not very popular. I always thought.
Well, the church that brought me into the Episcopal Church, the cathedral in Jackson, St. Andrews, after Medgar Evers died, there were groups of people who decided that they were going to integrate the churches. And they went to St. Andrews. Christoph Keller was the rector at the time, and he and a guy named John Anderson was one of the head ushers that day. He was the first person to greet me in the Episcopal Church. And they said, we're going to let people in, but we're not going to let in the media, and we're not going to let in the police, because it's a worship service. It's not. So there is that heritage, but, you know, I have to say, I was proud to see the clergy of the Diocese of Atlanta protesting against the death penalty. I mean, it may not have been a march, but there were a lot of callers out there. Right.
I'm interested to know if in your current role, which I assume includes some baptizing babies and new babies, you are encouraging people to pray the baptism of them.
To pray it on their own?
Seems like that's what you were doing.
Yeah. Well, I haven't, but I should write that down. No, I really have it. And I think a lot of it was coming out of seminary and professor saying, we shouldn't really talk, people preach about it too much. But I think a lot of that has to do is they teach it every day. So they think that people are preaching about it, but it's not really happening. But you're this whole, putting this all together really has put a bug in my ear. Like, this is what we should be doing. So I have baptized one baby. It's very fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the most fun?
Probably baptizing a baby, actually. Yeah, I mean,
What was fun?
the baby, he was kind of a big baby. They know that, so they're watching. So my boss had to hold the baby, and every time I've watched people pour the water into the font, they've done this great grand thing, and the water would splash, but I didn't take into account how short I was. And so as I poured the water, it didn't have as far to fall, so it went everywhere. The parents were wet, I was wet, the baby was wet, my boss was wet, the cloth that you dry the baby off was soaking wet. I thought, well, this is immersion, and this is how it's. And so by the time I got around to actually sealing the baby with the Holy Spirit, he was laughing at me. When I would walk close to me, he would laugh, and I thought, this is the kingdom of God right here. This is amazing. This is a lot of fun. Well, a lot of fun. And as I was telling them earlier, my parishioners have a lot of nicknames for me, and one is Baby Girl, so I'm now known as Baby Girl in Jackson. Just fun.
So what excites you most about the church?
I think this sense of community, and Mary Hunter and I have talked about this, but the community organizing, faith-based community organizing to help with these social justice issues, to actually be the dad, to go out. And I think there's real potential there, and I'm actually technically not a millennial, but I think there's potential there in bringing the millennials into the church through that. It's not the same walking and as you were talking about, but it's the same thing. It's the same principle, and I think that is really we have to get back out and be seen as people who really care about what it means to be living in community.
What do you mean when you say community? You don't have to use definition, just in general.
Sure. So, how about I give you an example? in Jacksonville, Florida, several years ago. Several churches got together, and they said, we got to do something about infants and infant death and infant mortality. So they get together and they organize in the community, and they start asking people what's the issue? What's the real issue? Why is this happening? And they realized that there wasn't good formula available, and that people weren't being taught how to breastfeed. And so they got together with the city government and hospitals, and they helped provide free formula, and they taught breastfeeding techniques within the hospitals, and they saw the infant mortality rate decline. That's what I mean by community organizing. And that's not a political issue. I don't think anyone wants to see the infant mortality rate up.
Where did you go to seminary?
Swanee.
Okay, that's just wondering.
I actually spent my first year of seminary at General in New York, and then spent my last 2 years at Swanee. So I have to kind of claim both. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thus concludes our 5-part series, having heard from many young priests and heard wonderful things about the church and their passions for the church. Which means, of course, that Palm Sunday is on Sunday and Holy Week is next week. So we look forward to seeing you walk with us through Holy Week. Amen.